Good morning, Gerten gardeners. My name is Karen, and I'm coming to you this morning from our south lot, our tropical lot, and I'm here today to talk to you about algae. So we're here in Minnesota. This is July, and we are in high summer, so we have a lot of sunshine, we have a lot of heat, and if you have anything in your yard having to do with water, you've probably seen some green stuff growing. And so we have a lot of folks who come to us asking, well, how do I get rid of this green mucky stuff, whether it's in the pond or it's in a bird bath or a fountain or even on your pavers. If you have water and you have sunshine for an extended period of time, the two of those things will create algae. And so we're going to be talking today and taking some questions from our viewers about algae, about how we can live with it and how we counteract it when it grows out of proportion and becomes a problem. So let's take our first question today.
How does it get into the pond?
Okay, so how does algae get to where it grows? This is a very interesting question because if you look, I've got a little tray here full of algae, and you might think that maybe I pulled this out of my pond or perhaps I pulled it out of a fountain, but actually I pulled this algae just this morning right off of our pavers here in an area that was poorly drained, and the algae has been breeding there and surviving in this little tiny pool of water on our pavers for about a month now. And it's not like we did anything special to create the algae. It's not on the top of our priority list to be a greenhouse that grows algae. That isn't a particularly profitable venture for us. But it does show really well how quickly algae grows. And the reason for that is that the little algae cells are pretty much in everything surrounding us. They're in the air, they're in the water, they can be blown across at any time. The wind passes by a body of water, which is everywhere in Minnesota. We have lots of bodies of water. It can pick up those little algae cells and pushes them up into the clouds. In fact, there's algae cells in the clouds above us right now. They drop in rain and then they get everywhere. So they actually can come to us through raindrops or through just the breeze if it's a very humid day passing past us. And essentially what happens is that when there's standing water and there's sunshine entering that standing water, the algae cells are able to take that sunshine, and like most plants that we have, they're able to use that sunshine to photosynthesize, that is to create food from sunshine, and they reproduce. So you can find algae anywhere there's a combination of sunshine and water.
Is there an amount of algae that's good and an amount of algae that's bad?
Yes, so algae is one of the building blocks of life. It is one of the building blocks of our ecosystem, and it is an incredibly important form of life for every single ecosystem that contains water on the planet. So you have algae growing on all the continents, with the exception of some frozen areas, and even in permafrost and places like that, you will still find old algae cells. So it literally is everywhere across the planet. And it is a very, very important building block of every single ecosystem. So we never want to get rid of algae totally, because everywhere that you have an ecosystem like a pond, or even on the blocks of our little tiles over here, that becomes an ecosystem, and that ecosystem, you have bacteria that feed on the algae, and then you have smaller life forms like arthropods and things like that feed on the bacteria, and then it goes right up the chain of life, right up the food chain. So there is an amount of algae that is safe for every single system. The times that we run into problems is that when we find algae in places where A, we don't want it, such as like our bird bath, and our fountains, or B, where it has run amok. It's gotten there's so much of it that it is negatively affecting the ecology of the system that it's in, and that's when we start to have to battle algae in our ponds as well. So algae is an important part of a pond ecosystem. You have to have it. Every healthy system has some colony of algae in it, which is feeding bacteria, which is feeding the rest of the life in the pond. What we don't want to do is have that algae run amok and take over the system.
Can toxins from algae harm pets and people? And do we have that here in Minnesota?
Yes. So most algae themselves are not toxic per se. But the process of the algae as they break down and decompose releases toxins, which can be very harmful for people, for pets, for fish, and other organisms living in the environment. So if you hear things about like the red tides in the ocean, particularly Florida has a big red tide problem. What happens is they have a particular kind of algae that builds up because the water is warm, and warm water plus sunshine equals lots of algae, and normally that would be healthy and a good thing. But the water gets too warm, all of this kind of algae starts to colonize, and then it dies. And that death of the algae releases toxins, and the toxins harm the fish, as well as they remove oxygen from the water column, and that can also kill the fish. So you have two things. You have removal of oxygen, and you have toxins being released into the water column, and suddenly you have lots of dead fish, you have people getting rashes when they're swimming, you have oceanic mammals getting sick, dolphins and things getting sick. So we hear about that process, and we know about that process in the south, in the ocean, but it also happens up here in Minnesota. Often you'll find stories of folks who have like walked to their local lake shore in high summer, and they're like, oh my God, there was like 20 dead fish on the shoreline at the beach today, and I have no idea why. And then they go in the water, and the water is very warm, and it's kind of a pea soup green color. And what's happened is that the algae have proliferated in that lake. They have begun to decompose, as living things do. They live and they die. They have very short lifespans. And their death causes the release of toxins. It also causes the removal of oxygen from the water column, and that then spawns a death for the animals who live in that environment. So it's really important that we keep algae in a balance, and that when we're treating algae that has gotten out of control, that we're very mindful of the fact that that process of decomposition can negatively affect our system too. So we have to be aware and able to manage that system, that process, as we go through taking care and getting our algae into balance so that it is where we need it to be, and that it is helping our ecosystem and not hurting it.
So how do we do that?
So let's talk first about some of the places that we definitely don't need to have algae growing because it isn't a benefit to an ecosystem. And that would be places like bird baths as well as fountains. So fountains are a great water source for our little animal friends, and they also add a lot of enjoyment to our homes. The sound of running water helps to relax you, and the negative ions released by the water are actually very healthy. So if you have it by a deck or a patio, it can actually add to both your mental and physical health, which is wonderful until you go out to your fountain in the middle of July and it is green. There's just like green smears all over your concrete, and the water is kind of a green color, and it's really not the pleasant fountain that you were hoping for when you purchased your product. So how do you take care of that? Well, the first thing to do is you're going to want to drain out your fountain or your bird bath, same thing, and you're going to want to dry it. So you want it dry when you work with it, and then you're going to add a gentle cleaner. And this is the cleaner that we use for our fountains and bird baths to get rid of algae and other organic stains. This is our Microbe Lift soy-based cleaner. It says it's for bird baths and statuary, but it also works beautifully on fountains. And we just spray this on and just kind of let it sit for a minute, and then we scrub all of the stains off. And for the most part, this does the trick. It'll take care of all the algae. It doesn't really take care of hard water. So you may need to use like a vinegar and water combo or a little bit of lemon shine to clean off your hard water stains. But when you're working with algae, this product is your best product for cleaning your bird baths and your fountains.
So there's no chemicals involved in this?
This is, well, any compound is a chemical. So there is chemicals, right? So even water is a chemical. It's H2O, that is its chemical formula. So everything is a chemical, and yes, this has chemicals in it, but it is a fairly safe chemical, particularly when used as directed. Okay, so one thing that you need to know about chemicals is it's going to have a warning label on it. All chemicals do. And so if you look at this one, the warning label probably says something like caution. There it is. Okay, caution. So this is caution. That means it's reasonably safe when used as directed. If you have a product like this, this is our cleaner, which is a much stronger, much more kind of intense cleaner. And this one is going to also have a warning label. You can see, so it says there's your first aid thing, and somewhere on here is going to say, just trying to find it. Warning. Okay, so we went from caution to warning. So caution is our lowest. Use it responsibly, but it's pretty safe. Warning means there's some danger, okay, to using it, even when you're using it per package direction. The ones that you want to really look out for are the ones with the crossbone, the skull and the crossbone on it, and you'll see that on things like paints and lots of other products around the house. If you take out a bottle of Drano, it has that skull and crossbones, right? That doesn't mean Drano isn't safe to use. It just means that if you use it improperly, like if your little kid takes a swig of it, it can be very, very dangerous. So do they pose some risk to us? Yes, all chemicals pose risks to us. Even water poses risks to us in improper amounts, right? So everything has some level of danger. We need to be using these things safely, and when it comes to any chemical, the label is the law. So make sure that you are following your directions to use it safely and properly. But our soy-based cleaner is a very gentle cleaner. It's safe for animals, it's safe for people, it's safe for your little birdie friends and your fishes. So you can use this without having to worry too much about your system.
Is there a certain amount of time that we should clean our fountains? I mean, is it once a week?
Yeah, so I recommend with fountains at least cleaning them once a month. And not just cleaning out the surface with your soy bird bath cleaner, but also cleaning out your pump, because your pump can get full of algae. They can also get full of any of the organic matter that is in the air. And in fact, I've had a couple of folks heading into the store lately, uncertain why their fountains weren't running the way they wanted them to, and in both cases it was because the pump was clogged. So it's really, really important, if you're working with fountains specifically, that you drain your fountain out. You take that time to pull your plastic grate off of your pump, clean that out, get a garden hose and a little scrubby brush and just clean it out, put it back, and then it's ready to roll again. So you always want to make sure not only are you cleaning off the surface of your fountain, but also the inner workings of your fountain to make sure that you're not leaving algae behind, you're not leaving all that dirt and debris stuck in your grate, and that's slowing your pump down. If you have grandma's three-tiered fountain that she's had for 20 years and it's kind of stained and yucky looking and it's got a lot of algae, but you want to bring it back to life again, that would be this product. This is the Wet and Forget Outdoor Moss, Mildew, and Algae Stain Remover. And this one is it's a much stronger formula. You need to use it as directed, and it has to dry, so you can't just like clean off the fountain and fill it right back up again. You have to let it dry and sit, but it will over time. It takes a while. It does not take overnight. It's a couple-week process. We'll clean off some of those old stains. So if you have a really, really stubborn algae stain that you cannot seem to get rid of, you can use a product like this as directed per label instructions. So there's certainly ways to clean off your fountains and your bird baths safely and responsibly. But what do you do about your pond, right? So what if you do if your pond has got tons and tons of algae growing in it and you're not sure how to clean that? Well, the first thing to do is to manually remove as much of the algae as you can. Now, algae kind of comes in two different, let's say, categories of forms. You've got your cyanobacteria, which is actually not a proper algae. It's a bacteria that photosynthesizes. So it's bacteria cells that have the ability to use the photosynthesis process to create their own food, which is really cool. And that is what causes that kind of pea soup green water effect. Okay, so if you have water that is looking algae-y and green, we've all seen it in ponds in the middle of summer. That is actually cyanobacteria. It's not a true algae. And there are different ways to handle that than there are the more familiar kinds of algae like this, which are like a mat algae, a hair algae, or a string algae. So this is a matting algae, and you can see it's a matting algae because it makes little mats, right? It makes like a little flat pancake of algae. The one that really drives pond owners crazy is string algae, and it looks like really, really long filaments or hairs, and you pull it out with your net and it's just like the grossest spaghetti you've ever seen. It's just like hairs of like greenness, and it's kind of stinky. The reason it's stinky is because it's using all the food in the system and it's breaking it down and decomposing. So it's doing its job really, really well. But we maybe want it to do its job a little less well, or maybe not in our pond. So that is the kind that is really going to give a lot of folks trouble. So the first thing is, if you've got a lot of string algae, get it out of the pond. And then you're going to want to use a cleaner This is an Oxy Pond Cleaner. This is Microbliff's Oxy Cleaner, and it's kind of the same deal as your OxyClean at home that you use in your laundry. It will break down to hydrogen peroxide as it does its thing. And you basically just sprinkle it on wherever you've got string algae. If you've got it on the inside of the pond, you want to drain that down a little bit so this can make contact and sit on there. Don't sprinkle it directly on your fish, but otherwise it's fine to use in a system with fish and other wildlife.
We have a question from Lori. She says, do plants aerate a pond? If yes, suggestions for those.
Okay, so we are going to get, good morning, Lori, by the way, and thanks for chiming in. We are going to get into aeration. Do plants aerate ponds? Yes. Do algae also aerate ponds? Oh yeah. In fact, algae are one of the very first things that ever created oxygen and allowed us to become oxygen breathing life forms. So algae is the basis for oxygen producing in the history of the world. So that is another reason why we don't want to wipe our algae out of our system totally, because every time you have sunshine shining on these little algae guys, they are going to take in carbon dioxide, they're going to release oxygen, and they are going to oxygenate your pond along with your plant friends. So that is another important function that they serve in the pond. It's another reason why we don't want to wipe them out entirely. Not only are they providing food for the ecosystem of your pond, they're also providing oxygen, which we all need. So we don't want to get rid of them entirely. We will talk a little bit about plants and their function in the pond as we get into that section of the talk here in a little bit later. I promise we'll get to it. So once we have gotten rid of the algae, we have to discuss what do we do to keep the algae either at bay in our fountains and our bird baths or in balance in our ponds. So the first thing that we want to do, and plants come into that, Lori, so like I promised, we're going to talk about it. So the first thing we want to do for our hard goods, for our bird baths and our fountains, is we're going to want to use a liquid barley product. So this is, barley is one of your best friends when it comes to algae control, whether it is in fountains or if it's in a pond. And in fact, we use a lot of liquid barley. This is the one that I use for the ponds and fountains over here on the lot. And what liquid barley does is barley, as it breaks down, the bacteria that eat barley break the barley down into humic acid. And the humic acid further breaks down into hydrogen peroxide. And if anybody has ever worked with hydrogen peroxide, you might have it in your medicine cabinet. You know that hydrogen peroxide is a very gentle bleach, which breaks down as it works into water and hydrogen. So it's H2O3, not H2O2. So it breaks down from H2O3 into oxygen molecules and water. So it's a very safe and gentle bleach for our outdoor systems, which is why if you're doing anything outdoors and you want it to be bird safe or fish safe, you want to work with hydrogen peroxide and not chlorine bleach, because chlorine bleach is very poisonous. We all know that chlorine is like a thing we use to treat the water to keep bacteria from growing in it, and there's a reason for that, because it's a very strong bleach. It's a very poisonous bleach. And yet we can swim with it right in our pools. So everything has a purpose if we use it safely. But you really want to stick to gentle treatment. And I'm usually not the first person to tell you to go take your bottle of hydrogen peroxide that you get from Walgreens and pour it in your pond. The reason for that is that the barley is using this in very, very teeny, tiny, very safe amounts. So this isn't a thing where you could even put like an eyedropper full of hydrogen peroxide into your pond and have it work the way that barley does, because this is a slow microdosing over a very long period of time, and that is how the barley safely and effectively prevents algae cells from growing out of control, right? So there will still be some algae in the system, but they won't be going out of control. So barley is probably my number one preventative for any system, because it's very gentle, it's very safe. It only has the caution sign on it when you look at your chemical warnings, which means it's the safest of the chemicals to use. And if you're using it in in your system, you don't have to use very much of it. You do have to, if you're using liquid barley, you do have to redose fairly regularly. But it works really, really well. It's very, very safe. It won't harm your finishes in your system, even though you're getting those micro doses of hydrogen peroxide. It's so small, it's in such tiny, tiny amounts that it's not going to affect the finish on your fountain. So it will help to prevent that algae from coming back. And when you use it in your pond, it will help to keep algae colonies healthy and at small amounts instead of taking over the pond, because they're getting a hold of all these extra nutrients. So we also have some other types of barley that you can use. I brought out our barley straw bales. So these are barley straw bales. And you basically put one in your pond and you let it do its thing, and when it sinks, you take it out, throw it into the compost, take the plastic netting off, throw that away, and put the barley in your compost, put another bale in. And this will take longer to work. So the liquid barley works right away. These guys take longer to work, but they last a very, very long time until the bale itself begins to sink. And what happens at that point is that the decomposition process in the barley switches from a bacteria process, which releases that humic acid, which releases the hydrogen peroxide, into a fungal process, which life on Earth is broken down by fungi. They're another one of our basic building blocks of life here on Earth. And then it's less useful to you in your pond. So you just put that right in the compost, let the fungi do their thing, break it down, turn it into yummy compost for your garden. So really, really good stuff, really easy to use. And that brings us to our next process.
One quick question.
Yes.
Anne asks, can it be composted if you treat your pond with cleaners?
Well, it depends on the kind of cleaner you're using, okay? So if you're using something like this, your OxyClean pond cleaner, yeah, you're probably fine. If you're using a really astringent chemical, I would stay away from putting anything with really strong chemical residue into a compost pile. So it just depends on the cleaners you're using. Some of them are going to be fine as long as if it says that it is safe for, if it's animal safe and it has a caution label on it, particularly if it's used for organic gardening, you're probably fine to put it in your compost, but use your best judgment, right? If you're using really strong chemicals, if you're using an algae killer, like this one, which we'll get into towards the end, I'm not sure I would compost anything, just because that is a really strong herbicide, and I don't like putting herbicide in my compost. So, use your best judgment, be smart about what you're doing. I prefer to use very gentle methods, so I don't have a problem composting anything in my pond, because I'm not using products like this. I'm using barley and I'm using plants. So I don't worry about putting stuff like that in the compost. But if you're using stronger chemicals, if you're using anything that's an herbicide, think about what you've got going on in your pond before you throw stuff in the compost pile. Just like you think about what you're putting in your garden. If you're throwing herbicide all over the place, don't put a rounded up dandelion in your compost pile, because it's going to kill everything that you use that compost on, because that herbicide is not going anywhere. Okay, so be thoughtful about what we put in our compost piles. So the next preventative, and it's probably the most important for pond systems, now we're walking away from our fountains because we've pretty much done what we need to do with them. Let's talk plants. So I have a little story to share with you guys here. Whoop, there goes our stuff there. I have a little story to share with you guys. So yesterday, one of my friends who works on the nursery lot, who takes care of our ponds up on the north lot, was telling me a little story about two of our ponds. So we have one pond that is on more of the south side of the lot that is very heavily planted. It has cattails, it has iris, it has blue juncus in there. There's lots of water lilies and things, tons and tons and tons of plants. And those plants have been there for several years now, so they're quite mature. And he said that he has probably pulled out maybe a total of a bucket's worth of string algae out of that pond all summer, which is just not a lot, right? It's a little bit, maybe it gets out of hand here and there, but he just hasn't had to do much work with it. But on the other side, on the north side of our pond display, he has a smaller pond. It's kind of a triangle shape. It's got big basalt columns that just kind of bubble and froth. So there's not a lot of plantings on that side. It's just kind of a decorative little pond with the waterfall and the bubbler with the basalt columns. Not a ton of plants over there. And on that side, he says that he has to pull out about a bucket of algae a week. Just tons and tons of algae. So what does that tell us? That tells us that when you are using plants in your pond, they are filtering the water. They are oxygenating the water. Lori, I got you. Yes, they are oxygenating the water, especially the ones that are growing underneath the water column. And they are taking the nutrients out of the water column that the algae, especially string algae, would eat. And they are taking them for themselves. They're using them to grow. If you look at this little guy, this is a green bulrush, a native bulrush that is planted in a barley planter. So I have two sources of algae fighting going on right here. I have my barley straw, which is releasing that humic acid, and then I have my green bulrush, and you can see his little roots popping right out here, and these go right into the water, and he is pulling nutrients right out of the water column, and he is using them to fuel his growth. So now he's a very happy green bulrush. You can see he's just like having a great life. He's living his best dream here. He's very healthy, he's very green, he's extremely happy, and so is my pond because we're using up all those nutrients in the water column.
Another quick question. Denise asks, what makes the water in the pond smell like sewage?
Okay, so what is sewage? Sewage is decomposing organic matter, usually poo, right? But all other kinds of stuff too. And when you smell that kind of decomposing smell, that means that there's organic matter in the water that is decomposing. It's dead, it is dying, and it is being eaten. So when you have that stinky smell, especially in a natural pond system, you probably have a lot of things that are dying because the water is too hot. There isn't enough oxygen in there, so you have algae dying, you have plants dying, you have possibly some wildlife, some fish that are having trouble getting oxygen. Maybe they could be dying too. So anytime you smell decomposing smell, that sewagey smell, hopefully, number one, it's not from runoff. Okay, so we're hoping that it's not polluted and that it's just a natural decomposing process. Pollution can also cause that smell too. So that if you continually smell it through the year, not at the height of summer when the water is really, really hot or the water levels are really low because of a drought, but if you're smelling it like in the spring when the water is cool and everything should be very happy, you may have a pollution problem. But if you're smelling it in high summer, it's because the water has gotten too hot. It's not being oxygenated. There's not enough water circulation or current to keep everything cool and happy, and things are starting to die. Then bacteria and fungi are starting to break it down and decompose it, and that's where you get that smell.
Kelly has a question. How do you treat a pondless water feature that is filled with rocks so plants are not an option?
So if you're doing a pondless water feature that's in the sun and you've got a lot of algae growth on the rocks as the water's moving past them, you can use an algicide, and we have a bottle of it right over here. I'm going to go this way so I don't step on the microphone. So this is our algae fix. It's a very strong algicide, and it's not something that I recommend using lightly. Algicides are what we would call a nuclear option when it comes to treating a system. It can help to clear especially string algae in systems. Yep. So here's kind of a system that's very similar to what we would call like a pondless water feature. So this is a feature where this is actually a pondless fountain, but it's basically a tiny version of a pondless water feature. So you've got rock, you've got a pump at the bottom that is pushing water from the basin up to the top of the feature and back down again. So this is eventually going to grow some algae, and on this feature I'll let that go because I think it's really pretty. Allow yourself to appreciate the balance of nature when she is in balance and how beautiful that can be. So a touch of green in the little cherubs, hair and on their knees and things, I'm going to let that go because I think that's really pretty. But if it's covered in string algae and really gross and you're like, okay, this has gone past beauty into like I am not keeping up with my maintenance on my system here, then you can use an algicide to treat the water. You can also drain the system and use that pond cleaner, the oxy cleaner that we were showing, just to kind of clean that off. And then you can treat your basin or your water supply with liquid barley to help to prevent that algae from coming back once you've cleaned it. So you can use your algicide to kill off the algae. You can use your cleaner to remove any of the stains, and then you go in with your liquid barley to help prevent it from coming back to the point where it gets crazy and ugly looking.
What are the best pond plants to use to outcompete algae?
Yeah, so let's talk about our good filter plants. And then we'll also get to Lori's oxygenators, because she had that oxygenator question. So that's a little bit different question than a filter plant. So here we have some examples of plants that all work as really good filters. And why do we want to filter our water? Because these plants help us to take the nutrient out of the water column, and they use it as their fertilizer, right? So they are using it to feed their growth, and they are helping to remove that nutrient from the water column, which then deprives the algae of the nutrients so they don't grow out of control, eating all the stuff that the plants would normally eat for you. So what are some really good plants that you can use as part of that process? Number one is always floaters. So as you can see on this water lettuce, he actually dips his whole root system into the water. And anytime you have root contact with the water, you're going to get better filtration than not. So water lettuce, they sit like this at the surface of the water, and they dip their little root system right down into the water, and they use this whole root system to capture nutrient in the water column to fuel their top growth. And they do that really well, and that means that they're taking up lots and lots of nutrients. They're what I call a nutrient sponge. They're not as fancy as our hyacinths. They don't make pretty flowers, but boy howdy do they take up nutrients. So if you have a nutrient overload, you got lots of fish and they're doing a lot of pooping, and your good bacteria in your filter are breaking all that pooping down into nitrate, that is a fertilizer, then you want to get some floating plants to take up that fertilizer. In addition, you have marginals. So marginals such as, we have a really popular, this is golden sweet flag, or a chorus. The chorus is a hardy marginal, which you plant it in at the shoreline of your pond, and it will just come back every year. Really, really nice filter plant. This, our green bulrush, this is a champion, built right here in Minnesota. So this is a native Minnesota plant. It lives all around our Minnesota wetlands, and it is a phenomenal filter plant. You can also use horsetails and cattails. Here I have a fun little example of a filter plant that you probably have all seen in the grocery store, but maybe not as a plant. This is rice. And we're not talking Minnesota wild rice. That is a little bit harder to get a hold of. This is actually, honest to goodness, Chinese white rice. It's not a hardy plant, but this is a red-leaved variant of it, and it is gorgeous. Number one, it is so, so pretty. And it does make rice in the autumn. So if you want to have like a little edible fun with your pond, you can plant some rice, harvest a little bit of rice in the autumn when the rice becomes ripe. And these guys also do a really good job of filtering. Now, they're not hardy, so you will have to buy them year after year, but they're a really fun addition to the side of your pond. And so now we've talked about, we're taking up the nutrient and stealing it away from the algae, but what other things can we do with our plants to prevent algae growth? Well, the next thing we have to do is we have to shade the water, because algae needs what to survive? It needs water and sunshine. So the more you block the sunshine on the top of your pond, the less overgrowth of algae you get, because you're filtering that sunshine and you're trapping it with your plants before it even gets into the water column. So what's the best thing for trapping your sunshine? Water lilies and water lotus. Now, we've sold out of water lilies for the year, so I hope everybody managed to buy some. If they haven't gotten any, we'll see again next spring. But we do have some lotus, and they're starting to look really nice. They're going to begin to flower here in just a few more weeks. Actually, I'm very excited to say that we finally have some flower buds on our lotus. And you can see one right there. Look at them! 2 little flower buds. I'm so excited. So lotus are another great shade plant if you haven't got a ton of shade plants in the middle of your pond. You can see how big these leaves are. Wow, what great umbrellas. They make really good umbrellas for the water column of your pond. So if you're still looking for a way to shade out some of that algae, come and grab yourself a lotus. And then we have our oxygenators. So oxygenators, like our, there's a couple that we sell right now. We still have hornwort in. We also have water wisteria. We've sold lemon bacopa and red rotala. And what happens with those guys, you can plant them at the side as a marginal, but you can also put them in the water column of your pond, and they'll live inside the water. They'll kind of hang out in the middle of the water column. As the sun goes and hits those leaves, they photosynthesize, they breathe in carbon dioxide and they breathe out oxygen. And those oxygen bubbles go into the pond, and that keeps the pond healthy, and it keeps the algae at regular levels, and especially if you have to kill off some algae, having those oxygenators in your pond to continue oxygen production helps to keep your pond system much healthier. If you're trying to do some algae removal in high summer when the water temperatures are very high, I always recommend adding some aeration, adding a bubbler. Whether you get it at a fish store, we have some inside. Because the water temps are so high, especially if you're running fish, when we're getting into 90-degree days, your water is starting to get up there in temperature. Oxygenate your water, add more oxygen. The more oxygen you can get, the better, to keep your system healthy, to keep any of your livestock that you have living in the pond healthy, and to keep those algae levels in control. Okay, I think that is all the questions that we had today. Thank you so much for all of our viewers. If you guys have more questions, do not hesitate to put those in the Facebook feed. I will be circling back throughout the rest of the day to answer any questions that you have. Otherwise, please come and see me here at Gertens. I'm here almost every day except Thursdays and Sundays, and when I'm not here, my phenomenal staff is here. So please come and see us. Please ask your pond questions. Come and get more pond plants. Come and get your cleaners. And let us know if we can be of any assistance. Thank you so much, you guys. Have a wonderful summer and have a great day.